and welcome to Week 3, The Americas, Spanish Conquest in History 230. This week we're going to take a look at the early onset of what could be considered North American and then eventually American history. But before we get into that, we have to kind of understand some of the events prior to, you could say, the Age of Discovery or the discovery of North America, or as I like to call it, the conquest of North America. So, in talking about the different peoples of North America and eventually South America, there's different ways that these peoples have been known. Um, with the coming of the Europeans, they originally believed that they landed in India, so they named them the Indians. Um, Now they are currently, I guess, erroneously called Native Americans because they technically are not native to America. We know that nobody's native to North and South America. The migration of people 15 to 20,000 years ago, people came to North America over the Bering Strait when the world was frozen up by Alaska from Russia. That was called the Bering Strait, and the land bridge there at Beringia. They came in through Alaska and then eventually filtered down into Canada, North America, down into Central and eventually South America, forming some great civilizations along the way. So to call them Indians is not necessarily politically correct. To call them Native Americans, the more accepted term, is actually incorrect because they're not native to America. There are different other terms that they go by, sometimes Amerindians or still some people still can use in different academic circles still use the term Indian because it's a term that they accept for themselves, regardless of the name that you give to the peoples here. We know that people came across the Siberia from Siberia into eventual what we call Alaska during the Ice Age. Anywhere between, the book says 12,000. I see 15 a lot in academic circles. Some are even dating it further back yet, but that's where they came from. Many of these groups of people filtered into and became some of the different civilizations that we see in different native groups across North, Central, and South America. Um, Interestingly, they are very culturally different from each other, and very different in terms of how they understood things. One of the things that we have to understand is that the natives, I'm going to interchangeably call them Indians, natives, Amerindians, and I'm using them all synonymously with each other. Um, the the Indians in North, Central, and South America were culturally distinct, but they had some different ideas, particularly in North America on the eve of the Europeans coming. You know, I could ask you the question, when did Columbus discover North America? And you would say 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? Um, what we have to understand is the distinction in cultures between what we now call North America and the Indians that lived here and the Europeans. Think of the history that we looked at last week with um, this idea of centralized government and of policies and of ownership from the time of the Greeks through the Romans into the medieval world and into the Enlightenment and eventually into what we call the modern age. Um, there has been this idea that there is ownership, that individuals can own the land and that it is a part of you. That is very, very European in their understanding. In fact, in native tongues in North America, when the Europeans came, there is not a word in native languages that we know of that denotes a meaning for land ownership. It was a concept that did not make sense in the Indians' minds. And so when the Europeans came and said, "This is mine now. This we are claiming this for Spain. We are settling this for England. We are calling this Louisiana for France." That doesn't make sense in the natives' mind because they don't understand land ownership. They did not conceive individual ideas of land ownerships and boundaries that way. And that from the very beginning is a stark contrast in how the Europeans were able to conquer North America. Some of the important distinctions that we should understand is in some of the great civilizations that come about. We'll get into in a little bit. we have to understand how they viewed their interactions with the Europeans and how that impacts their history. Now, one of the excuse me, things in recent history is this view of Columbus, and Howard Zinn is going to give you and has given you a fascinating perspective of Columbus and how we should remember him. Some would say he's revisionist. Others would say it's, I don't know, just trying to find the bad in history. You can interpret it how you want. But what we have to realize is that Columbus single-handedly opened, when he, so quote unquote, discovered the New World, when he bumped into the Caribbean islands, and then eventually led more Spanish people to find North, Central, and South America, he opened the gateway for a conquest that was going to be brutal, that was ruthless, and that was as close to an understanding of genocide as what we can understand. And that didn't just end with the Spanish. That went up through American history, through about 1880. That there's been this clash of ideologies, that there's been this physical war, these wars between Western Europeans and the natives that lived here. And what we have to understand too is that there, in the different peoples that were here, that these civilizations and these groups of people were utterly and completely destroyed by this discovery, by this conquest, by this ruthless warring that the Spanish, the French, the English, and eventually the Americans carried out on these people. So a question that with my on-campus students that we wrestle with more in depth than what I have time to do with you is, how should Columbus be remembered? You're going to read by Zinn different perspectives of Columbus. You're going to read in the text some different viewpoints on Columbus, and they have a brief discussion on page 23 with a whole idea about Columbus Day. And you can form your own opinions on this. I think what we need to think about, though, is how should we remember Columbus? I'm not one for completely revamping how we understand history, nor do I really support people who are just trying to be revisionist for the sake of, I don't know, being radical. That's not how I like to interpret these events. But I would challenge the notion that, you know, Columbus was this great guy who did wonderful things for Europe and eventually, you know, led to the settlement of North America. That's to an extent somewhat true. Yeah, he did pave the way for settlement, but even in our own nation's history, how we went about that settlement is something to be looked at critically, and I think with a critical eye. So that's the focus question that I really wanted to think about, is how should we remember Christopher Columbus? And the discussion of him happens, you know, on pages 21 and 20 and 22 and 23. So, and I'm just going through some different things. There are several different main civilizations in Central America, particularly Mexico with the Aztecs, and in South America, particularly Peru, the Inca civilization. And it's really in what's now modern day Mexico City. Was originally called Tenochtitlan, which was the capital city of the Aztecs. And it was, the Aztecs were brutally and ruthlessly conquered by Hernando de Cortez. And so that's a name to remember. Cortez, the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan, and it was really in South America, in Peru, which, fun fact, my father is from Peru, and so I've been there and I've studied this in depth on site in different places. It's in Peru that Francisco Pizarro defeated the Incas. So Cortez conquered the Aztecs, Pizarro conquered the Inca. And a good way to remember how this happened. There's a great book. I think it's by a name of the last name Diamond. I believe it's Jared Diamond, and he wrote a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And it was his whole thesis is it was through technology and disease that Europeans were able to take out populations of millions of people with literally only a few hundred. When you look at how Cortez and how Pizarro, with only literally a few hundred guys, were able to bring to its knees some of the greatest civilizations in Central and South America that had populations of millions of people. Um, how can you say, 300 guys took out 20 million people? Well, Diamond argues that it was through technology and that it was through disease. Um, I would give a hand up to disease. Disease is what single handedly destroyed most of the people. Here's why. Europeans, for hundreds of years, through the Middle Ages, were used to living near each other. They were used to living in close quarters. And as you do that, the human body biologically and naturally builds up an immunity towards certain diseases. Think of it this way. You've maybe have heard the saying, elementary educators, your first year of teaching, you're going to be sick all the time, and slowly you're going to build up your immune system to where you can be around any snotty-nosed, gross little first grader, second grader who's sneezing all over you, and you're going to be fine. I've always wondered, is there any scientific truth to that? I don't know. But what I do know is that Europeans throughout the Middle Ages lived around each other. They built up an immunity to certain diseases. The natives had not been exposed to any of these diseases and had not lived, by and large, centrally located in massive centers of population. And so when the Europeans come and they get off the boat, and some of them, obviously get sick on the sea voyage, and they interact with these natives, the disease begins to spread literally like wildfire. And you begin to see millions and millions of people falling deathly ill to these different diseases. Particularly smallpox was the one that took out probably most of the native populations. And back to Jared Diamond's thesis that guns, germs, and steel. The natives didn't have firearms. That was scary and terrifying. The Europeans had horses and they had armor. There's a report, I forget which battle it was, with the Inca, and Pizarro and his men were vastly outnumbered, and they slaughtered thousands of Incan people, and they only suffered like a few, literally like a dozen or so casualties. And you think, wow, how is that possible? Were they just superhuman and awesome fighters? No, they just had armor and they had guns and they had war horses. The natives had none of those. And they had been ravaged by disease. So those are things to keep in mind. Now, with the fall of these civilizations comes a new group of people called the mestizo. Mestizo are people, natives, Spanish, who mixed mixed with the native populations and had children with them. So this new group of people, these mestizos, these mixed Indian and white descendants, now look sort of European and look sort of native all in the same time. And this is a result of Spaniards taking on native women as slaves, or sometimes as sex slaves, sometimes as concubines or mistresses, sometimes as wives. But that begins the mestizo group of people, and that's an intermixing between the different populations. Now, there are some long-lasting ramifications for this. We have the fall of several great civilizations, particularly the Mayans beforehand, then the Aztecs, and then eventually the Inca. You have a massive loss of life on the Amerindian part, and that cannot be. I can't underscore that enough. The amount of life lost is just astronomical, And we really don't know how to document it, simply because one, well, there was no census data, but two, there was such a massive loss of life. The other massive impact, as far as economically speaking, is the rise in Spanish wealth and influence. With the conquering of Central and South America, if you ever saw the movie The Pirates of the Caribbean, and they talk about Aztec gold, um, that's true. There was lots and lots of gold and silver in Central and South America. In fact, when Pizarro was conquering the Incas, he took hostage their emperor, their king, and he held him ransom. And he said, as a joke, he said to the Inca, "I want you to fill 2 barns. Think. I guess for us, think a big red barn on the farm. I want you to fill literally from the ceiling to the walls to the roof full of gold. Give me 2 barns full of gold." And the Inca literally said, "Okay," and they did it. They filled 2 barns chock full of gold all the way to the top, and they said, "Give us our emperor." And Pizarro killed him, and then took the gold, and then overthrew the empire. Um, so they had the gold to do it. That literally could do it. There were Spanish ships that we're still discovering today that were so heavy laden with silver and gold, they were so overweighted that they sunk on the way back to Europe. So the amount of natural resources that were here in North, Central, and South America are unimaginably um, used in boosting Spanish wealth and influence. It's the discovery of that amount of gold and silver that led to the English and the French saying, "Hey, I want a slice of this awesome piece of pie when it comes to gaining wealth, power, and influence." And so that's why the French and the English decided to settle in North America, because they said, "Hey, maybe we can find gold just like the Spanish did when they conquered the Aztecs and the Inca." So that's another major lasting impact. It led to the rise of Spain, but it also led to other European nations, which we can thank the English, because they're our brethren when it comes to founding of our country. Why did we start in Jamestown? We were looking for gold. Why? Because we wanted to be like Spain. And also, you have now the birth of the mestizo, mixed Indian and white European group of people, which you can see in still vibrant in Peru today. I guess my own ancestors are a product of this mixing of European and natives as well. So that's the lasting impact that we see. And like I said, it led to the desire for English and French settlements in North and South America as well. So the first settlement is Jamestown. Jamestown was founded in 1607 by the English. Why did they come here? They were looking for gold. That didn't pan out so well. In fact, lots of them died that first year, called the Starving Winter. There's now evidence to suggest that they were, in fact, so starving that they ate each other. They recently found, I think in 2012 or 13, they found like a 13-year-old girl who was a skeleton, and she was obviously, through forensic analysis, she was chopped up into pieces and eaten. We found bones of this girl, and it marks a fact that yes, cannibalism did take place at the English settlement of Jamestown during the Starving Winter. So that was one of the first groups of people to come here. They landed in Virginia. Excuse me. The English then sent another group, the Puritans, also known as the Pilgrims. They were led by William Bradford. They land at Plymouth Rock. And, we all know the wonderful story of the first Thanksgiving. Most of what we think of in the first Thanksgiving is probably a bunch of bull. One of the best shows out there it's called I can't think off the top of my head. It's something about the Native experience, and it's all about the misconceptions held by Americans about our history, and it looks at American history through Native eyes. Fascinating take on how we understand that, but again, we don't have time to get into that too much. It's through the Pilgrims that they're the ones who come up with the Mayflower Compact. That's first evidence of people making choices in the government. That has implications for American history for us as well. The Pilgrims, obviously, they land in Massachusetts and land with the Plymouth colony there, and the rest with history, and you can read the rest in the book. This eventually leads to colonial life. There you go. That's what it was called. We Shall Remain, PBS documentary that talks about the native perspective of a bunch of different events in American history. Well worth your time if you've got a half hour, 40 minutes at night when you're trying to shut your mind off and you want to watch something that's educational and very interesting. I recommend watching We Shall Remain. It is very well put together. This sort of is where we want to end, because next week we're gonna look at colonial life, but you can't really talk about the native and the conquest without getting into colonial life because they kind of overlap with one another. What we need to remember is, like the Spanish, the English did the same thing. Fascinatingly, the English, the Pilgrims, those lovely God-fearing people who held a Thanksgiving dinner, within 50, 60 years, they were waging war in a ruthless and brutal way with the native populations of New England. I could ask you a trick question and say, what was the deadliest war in North American history? And when you read that, at quick glance, you might say the American Civil War, because we lost like 700 or 800,000 people. That would be right if I asked you a question about American history. However, the deadliest war in North American history is King Philip's War. When you look at the number of people killed compared to the population, the number of cities destroyed compared to settlements, the amount of money spent in terms of money made and in the economy, King Philip's War during the time of the English settlements of New England is the deadliest war. And what these God-fearing, supposedly Christian pilgrims did was waged a brutal and ruthless war in which they killed and slaughtered many, many people. Worth a look at. I would take a look at the We Shall Remain after the Mayflower. It's worth your time again in understanding the implications of when we celebrate Columbus and when we celebrate the settlements in the first Thanksgiving. When we celebrate our own westward expansion in American history, you have to think about it from another perspective. And Thanksgiving actually marks the beginning of the end for the natives. So when we celebrate Thanksgiving in November, and we remember a time of harvest and a time of blessing, in a native perspective, Thanksgiving marks the beginning of the end for a way of life and a culture that has been lost, all in the sake of conquest. Interesting take on events that we oftentimes might not look as deeply as we should. Have a great week, everybody.